who is paying for Labor's budget plans? When we look at all of these things, what were they saying on the news? Oh, it's only an increase of $7.4 billion on top of what Liberal had in their budget plans.
Oh, I mean, I just spent that on the weekend.
It was just easy. It was just no worries at all. But essentially, I was showing you this graph or this table first when we jumped on and started talking about this. The thing that I fell off my chair when I was looking at the debt that Australia has. Now, they say that it's going to be around about $1 trillion. The graph and table that I've got here says about last year was about 834. So I would probably suggest it's going to land around 1.1 trillion is what they're suspecting. Rewinding 15 years, Charlie, what was the debt that Australia had in comparison to our GDP, which is gross domestic product, which is kind of the value.
So what year are we going with here? I'm looking at this lovely chart.
I'm going to go to the lowest one. Go 2007.
Right, so 2007, our debt to GDP was 9.7%.
Let's fast forward. Just go a decade. What was it?
In 2017, it was 41%.
Just a little jump.
Wow.
So it has jumped from essentially 10% to 40%. So it's a 30% jump. And now
this chart actually misses 2020 and 2021, but I suspect it's probably over 50% now.
Exactly. Now, it was funny, and I actually can't believe that you knew this number. So what is America's debt? So the entire debt of the country compared to the GDP or the gross domestic product for the country?
It's 115%, I believe.
Now, does that scare you? If you were in the United States, as a person in the United States, would that scare you? Or do you think that is healthy? And if Australia got to that, would you support it? Or would you say, that's probably a little bit too risky?
All right. How do I think about this? I have an interesting point of view is a few things I'll say here. So ultimately, who's paying for this? Us. Like the people who live in a country ultimately pay the taxes and pay for everything that gets done. Like we don't just get free NBN. They're not going to spend, $40 billion on this thing. Like we pay through it through taxes. If you're a business owner, which I would assume everyone listening to this podcast is, like how fun is it paying that tax bill or that PAYG or GST or whatever it is? Like all that money combined up is the things that pay for this. So that's ultimately who's going to pay for it. What I think is really interesting is that the government's strategy is really around like inflation.
Yep.
I'm going to be honest on it. So the idea is they're spending money today and then future generations will pay for this debt. But I want to frame this differently. I mentioned in a previous episode, my nan actually bought a house for $9,000. And it's like Grant and myself have laughed in the idea of like buying that house today because it'd be easy.
Very.
That's essentially the strategy government's trying to take here is they're like, well, $1 trillion, like it's a lot today, but 100 years from now, what's $1 trillion? Probably nothing, or even 50 years, right? So inflation plays a key role in debt being able to be attained. And that's why governments really like there being a little bit of inflation is to make debts easier to repay. However, coming back to this topic here is like, is there like, how do we feel about debt? I kind of think about this in like, if debts, when we think of it in the eyes of government, we tend not to connect. So if I said to you, look, we've got a friend and his debt to income ratio is 50%, what would you say?
That's a good thing.
He's got a little bit.
It's great.
Well, it might be. It depends on the debt.
Oh,
but if I said to you it's like 200%, what would you say?
Yeah, no, that's definitely not a good thing.
Yeah, so like where I think this is interesting is if you had a friend, and let's just use a person here, and it's like you saw their debt growing every year and they're getting really out of hand with debt and they're just buying reckless things, like what would you say the future of that person looks like?
It's not going to look very good at all.
Completely. And I think we need to look at this in the same light is I'm not overly concerned about the debt Australia has right now, but if it got to a point where it was like, wow, this is getting crazy, our government might have to start making bad decisions to clear its debt or default on its debt. And that's when business and investing or property we own or our share market could get decimated.
Yep.
Absolutely decimated. And this is where at a certain point, and I'm not actually sure, I haven't set this point for myself, you may actually want to reconsider, well, if I own a lot of property in Australia, maybe I want to reduce that and actually buy property overseas or in countries that are more responsible with their debt or responsible with how they run their economies. Now, again, we see this already is like what was it? It's like what did they say when in Venezuela it was like, when things started really getting crazy with debt in Venezuela, what did everyone try and do was get US dollars?
Yep.
Because their currency was inflating at a huge rate and they needed something safe to store it in. Well, the same could effectively happen in this regard here in many parts of the world, so that they end up in currency crisis. Now, I realize I'm getting quite technical on things here of like, well, what does that look like? I think ultimately what I'd be thinking about if I was an Australian business owner is like, okay, well, if Australia's debts get to a certain point, do I want to start doing business in the US instead?
Yep.
Or doing business in another part of the world because I would much rather earn in their currency, or I would much rather have something like that available to me. And if it got extreme, you may even consider relocating. Like, again, what happened in Venezuela or some of these other countries is things get extreme and then people look to relocate out of them because they're not happy with how it's being governed. I don't think Australia will get there. We are fairly well run and a part of, like, there's many things in place to protect things from happening like that. But let's never say never. From an investing point of view, though, when countries get out of hand with their debt, if you've got locked into that currency, you're running a risk. So if you'd bought property in Venezuela, noting that inflation may have worked for you in the debt on that, it might have been really easy to pay off down the road. But there's actually some downsides if no one wants to buy that stuff.
Yep.
Or people can't save deposits or anything like that.
And it's really interesting, that sentiment that you shared there. So right now, everybody wants to come to Australia, which is fantastic. So there's still a huge demand for what we're producing. And I'll incorporate property into that as well. All right, so the people still want what we've got. They still want to buy our products. They still want to live here. They want to do all of those things. But if that changes, where it's like, well, no, it's too expensive here compared to everywhere else. There's no real value here. Or they look at going, well, this entire environment is going to be overinflated. My money is better somewhere else. That is kind of the indicator we're looking for. And the interesting thing around what we've been covering in previous episodes, Charley, as well as this episode, is all of these valuable indicators that suggests that that is not the case, at least in my opinion, and I know, Charley, you share a very similar opinion, in Australia. Like, we're looking at, and we covered in the last episode, the green mining boom, right? And an interesting point that we were talking about is 15 years ago, when we had almost no debt, was thanks to the mining boom, right? Because so much money was coming into the Australian economy, which potentially, and I'm speculating, might happen again. It might not be to the same extent. It might be more so, but that is actually going to help us in the long run for us now. So if we're seeing these indicators, great, we just go, well, how are we going to play that? I'm to your same as you, Charley, very bullish on property. I think property is great. We've got all this immigration, we've got the green mining boom, we've got all of these things happening that I just see it always or consistently going up, especially for the short to medium term. But for the other point that you're mentioning, if this starts to get out of hand, and I disagree with some of the things the government's investing in, like if they invest in things that I do not think is for the betterment of the country, like imagine they just said, well, all wages are going to double. And I look at that and I say, well, that's going to cost you a fortune. But what value as a business owner and as an investor am I actually going to get out of that? The question I'm asking myself is, where is my money better spent? Where is it better for me to go and get customers from? Where is it better for me to operate? Because as business owners, we get that option.
Hey, fellow business owner, if this topic and value-packed short video has resonated with you at all, and you want to dive deeper into being a full stack business owner, check out the full episode by clicking the link on your screen or in the description right now.